Isn't it a great day to be a Christian? Open your Bibles to John chapter 15. John chapter 15. I realize that the bulletin says we're in 1 Corinthians 11, and most of our time this morning will be spent in 1 Corinthians 11. But let's start in John chapter 15. Down in verse 13, Jesus said, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." Tomorrow's Memorial Day. In the midst of all the trips to the lake and barbecues and summer movie releases, sometimes it's easy to forget what Memorial Day is supposed to be about. Memorial Day is observed on the last Monday of May each year to remember the people that have died while members of the United States military, the U.S. Armed Forces. But how and when did Memorial Day originate? Well, here are some facts that I looked up that you may or may not have known. Memorial Day celebrations actually started back in ancient times, back in 431 BC. The Greeks honored the soldiers who had died in the Peloponnesian War. A philosopher named Pericles came to have a public ceremony to remember those that had died in that battle. And that was the first community ceremony to honor dead military members, as far as people know. And then after that, the Greeks and the Romans kept having such festivals, such celebrations, such commemorations. In the United States, one of the first Memorial Days was celebrated right after the Civil War by some newly freed slaves on May 1st in 1865 in Charleston, South Carolina. They went and decorated the graves of the soldiers who died during the war. Back then it was called Decoration Day because they put flags or flowers on the graves, and eventually over the years Decoration Day became known as Memorial Day. Civil War Union General John A. Logan called for an official day of remembrance, and he called for it to be on May 30th, and the reason they picked May 30th is because there weren't any significant battles on that day, so they could pick a day when there was peace to go back and think about those who had died in the war. After World War I, people decided, well, maybe we need to recognize people from other wars and not just the Civil War. In 1950, Congress passed a law asking the president to issue a proclamation calling on Americans to observe Memorial Day, to remember those who had died, and to pray for permanent peace. 1968, Congress passed the Uniform Monday Holiday Act, which set Memorial Day as the last Monday in May so that there'd be a 3-day weekend. But Memorial Day wasn't a federal holiday until 1971. On Memorial Day, the president requests that all the governors of the United States and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico fly the state flags at half-mast. Flags are flown at half-mast on all the federal buildings and grounds and on naval vessels. In fact, they've asked private citizens to fly the flags at half-mast up until noon. After noon, you raise the flag back up and you celebrate the country. Tomorrow's Memorial Day, but it's more than just another holiday. It's more than just a day off of work. It's a day when we need to remember the sacrifices. Freedom has never been free. Freedom has always come at great cost. We need to remember Memorial Day. Now, Memorial Day and Veterans Day are two different things. Veterans Day is set aside to remember all the people that served in the military. Memorial Day is for those who died in the military. And there have been quite a few of them. In the Revolutionary War, there were 4,435 patriots that died to try to establish this country. During the Civil War, 364,000 United States troops and 133 Americans that fought for the South died. In World War I, 116,000 American troops died. World War II, 407,000 Americans died in war. 54,000 died in Korea, 58,000 in Vietnam, over 4,000 in Iraq, and 2,459 died in Afghanistan. That includes the last 13 that died during the withdrawal. Overall, more than 1 million Americans have died in war, in conflict, in battles for our freedom. The freedom we have now, we've got freedom to vote for our elected representatives. That we can make fun of the ones that are elected. We don't have to worry about being punished or suffering because of that. We've got the freedom to say our piece about whatever comes up. And we've got the freedom to worship or not to worship, as people choose to do. But that freedom has never been free, and tomorrow we need to remember the cost. Tomorrow in America, people of all ages and ethnic backgrounds and faiths will be joining together to remember the sacrifices of people that died for our country. Those brave men and women made the ultimate sacrifice so that we could be here this morning and not have anything to worry about. As we read in John 15:13, no one has greater love than this, that one would lay down his life for his friends. And our servicemen and women did exactly that. They gave their lives for us. But sadly, tomorrow for many people is just another 3-day weekend. It's just another day off of work. It's the official start of summer, the beginning of school vacations. It's time to eat too much and spend too much time in the sun. But the freedom to enjoy all those blessings was purchased with the blood of those that fought to defend our Constitution. Don't ever forget that. That's tomorrow. Today is also Memorial Day. Today we gather to remember someone who died for something that's much more important, much more precious than physical freedom. Today we remember someone that died to set us free from the law, who died to set us free from sin, who died to set us free from the fear of eternal damnation. Today is the Memorial Day for Jesus Christ. In the New Testament, Jesus said every time we approach the Lord's table, we're to do it in remembrance of Him. That's what a memorial is, when we remember. On the first day of every week, we gather here to remember the life, the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus, the one that came to earth to die, to set us free. Now let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, starting down in verse 23. Paul says, "For I have received of the Lord that which also I delivered unto you, that the Lord Jesus, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he brake it and said, Take, eat. This is my body which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. After the same manner also he took the cup when he had supped, saying, This cup is the New Testament in my blood. This do ye, as often as ye drink it, in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you do show the Lord's death until he come." Jesus declared whenever we gather around this table, whenever we partake of the bread and drink of the cup, we're to do it in remembrance of him as a memorial. Well, could it be possible that we forget Jesus? I mean, everybody knows Jesus. How can we forget that? But sometimes I think it might be possible for us to forget who he was and what he did. In a lot of religions, Jesus is seen as a nice man. He's seen as a great teacher. He's seen as a powerful example. But they don't get this death and burial stuff. They don't understand all the blood and the sacrifice. That just doesn't seem very appealing. Several years ago, a man named Donald Nash wrote in a paper called The Christian Standard that some churches have done away with communion as part of their worship. Some churches offer the Lord's Supper in a different room that people that want to go partake can, but it's not part of the community worship. It's not part of the public worship, because there are people that are coming in that they're looking for a church home, and these seekers that don't understand might be offended that there's too much talk about blood and dying and all that kind of stuff. They don't want to scare anybody off, and so they said, now if you want to go partake of communion, go to this room. You can do it after a while. Apparently they figure that communion is such a strange thing that it might scare off visitors, and by doing that, basically they said it's not as important as our singing and our praying and our studying, so they've decided that that's not as important. We need to understand that that is the reason why we came here this morning. Together around this table is the reason. In Acts 27, it says, on the first day of the week, the disciples came together to break bread. That was the purpose of them coming together on the first day of the week. But why do we need to do this to remember Jesus? Well, because we get distracted by other things. We talked a minute ago, what is this weekend? Well, it's Memorial Day. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means we're going to get a day off work. We're going to have some extra time at home. But do we really remember what Memorial Day is supposed to be about? It's supposed to be about those that have died and sacrificed themselves for us. But what do people usually do? Well, they go on picnics, or they go fishing, or they stay at home and watch TV. They have cookouts. But what does it mean to actually remember? It's not just to say, oh, I remember that. I know that those folks died. That's not what remembrance is. In some places, people will actually gather in military cemeteries. They'll have prayers. They'll have speeches. Maybe there'll be a bugler playing taps. They'll be planting flags on the graves. Now, I'm not saying we need to feel guilty because we don't do that tomorrow. What I'm saying is that Memorial Day doesn't have the impact it used to because people don't really observe it the way they used to. Because of that, we tend to forget. That's what can happen to communion. That's why we gather here on the first day of every week, and we need to remember why we're here and what it is. That's what we talk about communion on the first day of every week. It's part of reminding ourselves who Jesus is and what he did for us. 1 Corinthians 11:28 says, "But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of that cup. For he that eateth and drinketh unworthily eateth and drinketh damnation to himself, not discerning the Lord's body." We're supposed to be thinking about Jesus. We're supposed to be understanding who he was and what he did. And if we're not, then we're in trouble, because we're supposed to examine ourselves and make sure that we're remembering and that we're doing it in the right way. It seems every Sunday the church in Corinth was coming together. They were taking a communion. The church in Corinth had a lot of problems, and one of them was the way they took communion. See, they had a kind of unique worship service. Apparently, they all came together for a fellowship meal. And then after the fellowship meal, they had communion, but it wasn't really a fellowship meal because they didn't have any fellowship. It seems the rich people brought their steaks and the poor people brought their soup, and nobody shared with each other. They all ate and drank. They weren't in union. There was no communion. They weren't doing it together. And because of that arrogance and that selfishness, Paul said they were having problems with it. Down in verse 30, it says, "For this cause many are weak and sickly among you, and many sleep." People were getting sick. Some of them had died because they weren't examining themselves. They weren't doing communion the way it was supposed to be done. And Paul warned them they needed to check themselves out before they got in trouble to avoid punishment from God. For Christians, communion is a time of judgment, but it's self-judgment. It's a time when we're supposed to look at ourselves and think, do I realize what I'm doing here? Do I understand the importance why we gather here this morning? Communion is when we come into the presence of Jesus, but it's when we come face to face with our sin. We need to make sure that we understand that. If we have visitors here, what better place to tell them about Jesus than around the table? Talk about the sacrifice that he made. Paul says, whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. We're telling people about Jesus. When we gather around the Lord's table, it's to proclaim Jesus. It's to tell people about what happens. Now, when he says remember, does that mean just don't let it slip your mind? Does it mean we reminisce about the sufferings so that we feel really awful or feel really thankful? No, for Christians, remembering is not just some ambiguous mental activity. It's not just, oh yeah, I remember that. In our culture, remembering means recollecting or recalling something to mind that happened before, but that's not what remembering was about to the Jews. To the Jews, when they remembered something, they celebrated it. Let's look at two examples from the Old Testament. Go to Genesis chapter 9. Genesis chapter 9, beginning in verse 14. Says, "And it shall come to pass when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the water shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh, and the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth." We look up in the sky and we see a rainbow. We don't say, oh yeah, there was a flood and God's not going to do that anymore. No, we remember the covenant. We remember the promise that God made to Noah. We remember that the world's going to be destroyed again, but it's not going to be water. We remember the promises that God made. Of course, the preeminent picture of redemption in the Old Testament is in Exodus. Exodus chapter 12, the Passover meal. The Israelites were told to put blood on the doorposts and mantle of the doors, and then death passed over. They were spared. Exodus 12, verse 14 says, "And this day shall be unto you for a memorial, and you shall keep it a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it a feast by an ordinance forever." It was a memorial. It was something that they did to remember. It wasn't just, oh yeah, the angel passed over. They knew why. They understood why. They participated in this memorial. Every day it was this powerful participatory event. It wasn't just a mental exercise. It wasn't, oh, I remember. They actively remembered it. John Flavel was a Puritan who wrote back a long time ago, but he said there are two different kinds of remembering. He said there's a speculative, transient memory that you just think about and that passes, and then there's an affectionate, permanent memory. Here's what he wrote. He said, "A speculative remembrance is only to call to mind the history of such a person and his sufferings that Christ was once put to death in the flesh. An affectionate remembrance is when we so call Christ and his death to our minds as to feel the powerful impressions thereof upon our hearts." That's what communion's about. For Christ to be in our hearts, to remember what he did and to understand that he did it for each one of us. When the Lord's Supper is served, Christians should experience an affectionate remembrance because the gospel is being applied to our hearts. We need to understand that this sacrifice was because of my sin, that our grace was purchased by Christ's death. New husbands understand the importance of remembering. I can't imagine, for example, Nick going to Brooke and say, "Hey, by the way, I remember today's our anniversary." She's not going to say, "Well, that's great. I'm glad you didn't forget." That's not what remembrance is all about. He's probably going to bring a card or maybe some flowers or take her out to eat or something to show that he remembered. There's going to be a remembrance of that event. It's not just, oh yeah, this was the day. We don't remember something by just stating the fact. We understand that when the Lord's family gathers around this table and we remember, it's not just, oh yeah, Jesus died. We understand why, and that he died for me, and that he died for you. Every time we take communion, the gospel's proclaimed. We remember the grace that was purchased with that blood. We remember his body was nailed on the cross because of me. And when we really think about what that represents, that's what gives us hope. That's what gives us joy. That's why we're here. There's a man named Robert Tinsky, and he was born Jewish. He was raised up in Judaism. But when he got older, he wasn't really satisfied, and so he started visiting other religions. And one day he came into a Christian church, and he observed as they partook of the Lord's Supper, and he didn't understand. He knew it was kind of similar to Passover, but he didn't understand it, so somebody took him aside and explained it to him. That the bread is the body that was nailed to the cross, and the blood was shed for forgiveness of our sins. And he decided that that's what it was all about. He was so impressed that he became a Christian. In fact, he became a gospel preacher. And what about spreading that message to other people? That's what we're called to do. To understand the gift that purchased our salvation, and to let other people know about that. That our salvation was purchased with Jesus' precious blood. That's why you need to be a Christian. The only life worth living, the only death one would dare to die. Won't you allow Jesus to add you to his church this morning as we stand together, as we sing?